Welcome everyone. Welcome to our discussion on land rental contracts. The entire issue will be discussed in two modules. In this particular module, we shall at first try to get an idea about the different types of land rental contracts. After that, we shall evaluate the contracts in terms of their efficiencies. Then we shall try to find out the relative importance of the contracts in the agricultural sector. As we all know that inequality in the land distribution pattern leads to the emergence of land market. We have also discussed in our earlier module that in the developing countries there exists huge inequality in the land distribution pattern. So, there is inequality in the land distribution pattern, therefore, there also exists a land rental market. So, given the existence of a land rental market, our first question will be, what are the different types of land rental contracts? In other words, we shall try to know how many types of land rental contracts do exist in the land rental market. Now, if we look at the land rental market, we find that there exist mainly three types of contracts. The first one is fixed rent contract, the second one is sharecropping, and the third one is pure wage contract. Now, let us look at each of the contracts in a bit detail. Let us start with fixed rent contract. Now, what happens in a fixed rent contract? In a fixed rent contract, the landowner do not cultivate the land directly. Instead, the landowner gives the land to the tenants or a particular tenant depending on the size of the land. What does the tenant do? The tenant cultivates the land on behalf of the landlord. After the production process is completed, the tenant then gives a fixed sum of money to the landlords. So, in this case, the landowner collects a fixed sum of money from the tenant or tenants per year or per season. Now, let us consider the sharecropping. Now, what happens in sharecropping? In sharecropping, as in the earlier case, the landowner do not cultivate the land. Instead, here also the landowner gives the land to the tenant then cultivates on behalf of the landowner. But the major difference between the earlier contract and sharecropping is this: in case of sharecropping, the tenant gives a particular share of the total produce to the landowner. For example, suppose there is a 75-25 contract. This in turn means that after production, the tenant will give 25% of the total produce to the landowners. The landowners will get 25% of the total produce. The remaining 75%, remains to the tenants. Now, let us consider the third form of contract, which is known as pure wage contract. Now, what happens in case of pure wage contract is that the landowner gives the land to the tenant for cultivation, but instead of getting something from the tenant, the landowner gives the tenant a fixed amount of wage. That means the tenant here becomes a laborer in the landowner's land. So, these are the three major forms of contracts which we observe in the land market. Now, these three forms of contract can also be expressed algebraically. How can we do it? For this, let us start with a generalized case. Suppose the total rent earned by the landowner can be represented as R, capital R, which is equal to alpha y plus f, where capital Y represents the level of output, while alpha and f are fixed values. Now, given these generalized form of contract, we can consider three special cases. What are they? Let us consider case 1 first. In this case, let us assume that the value of alpha is equal to 0, while the value of f is positive. So, in this case, the total rent earned by the landowner, which is represented by capital R, becomes equal to capital F, which is in fact a fixed value. So, in this case, the tenant is giving the landowner a fixed sum of money, hence the landowner is earning certain fixed value. So, this is the case of a fixed rent contract. What happens in case 2? In case 2, we are assuming that f is equal to 0, while alpha takes a value that lies between 0 and 1. If this is the case, then the rent earned by the landowner will become equal to alpha into y. In other words, in this situation, the landowner is getting an amount of rent which is a positive function of the total output. So, here the landowner is getting a share of total output. This is a typical sharecropping contract. In case 3, let us assume that alpha equal to 0 and f is negative. Again, in this situation, the total rent earned by the landowner will become equal to capital F. But there is a difference. What is the difference? In case 1, the value of f was something positive, but here the value of f is something negative. What does it mean? It means that instead of earning something, the landowner is in fact offering something to the tenant. So, this is the case of fixed wage contract, where the landlord pays the tenant a fixed amount of wage. So, in this way, from a generalized form, we can reach to the algebraic expression of three types of contracts. Now, given the three types of contracts, the question that naturally comes in our mind is that if there are three types of contracts, then how to compare between the two? How can we say that which contract is better compared to other, which contract is comparatively worse compared to other? There are various ways to compare between the contracts. However, perhaps the best way to compare between the contracts is to compare them in terms of efficiencies. Now, if we compare the contract in terms of efficiency, we find that there is a general idea. What is the general idea? The general idea is that the fixed rent contract is the optimal form of contract. Why is it optimal? The idea is something like this: sharecropping is considered to be inferior compared to the fixed rent tenancy due to certain incentive related problems. At the same time, the fixed wage tenancy also contains some incentive related problems and hence is inferior compared to the fixed rent contract. Now, given this general idea, the next question that arises in our mind is, how can we reach to such idea? Or in other words, what is the reason behind such argument? To find out the reason underlying such argument, let us at first start with the case of an owner cultivator. Now, in the diagram, we represent output and cost in the vertical axis, while labor is represented in the horizontal axis. The concave curve represents the production function, while the positively sloped curve represents the total cost of production. Now, in this case, the owner cultivator cultivates the land herself. So, the owner cultivator tries to maximize the level of profit. Where will the profit be maximized? As we all know that the profit is maximized at that point where the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. In this diagram, that point will be observed at the level where the slope of the production function will be equal to the slope of the cost of production line. Now, in this figure, this occurs at the level of output AL and the corresponding level of employment OL. Given that this is the benchmark case, we can now say that the level of output AL is the efficient level of output and the level of employment OL is the efficient level of employment. Now, once we have reached this benchmark, our next task will be to find out what happens in case of fixed rent contract. See, in case of fixed rent contract, after the total amount being produced by the tenant gives a fixed sum of output to the landowner. So, of the total level of production, the tenant gets an amount which is the total value of production minus a fixed amount. So, in terms of diagram, we can represent this by a parallel downward shift of the production function. This is shown in the figure. In the figure, as in the earlier case, we have represented output and cost in the vertical axis and labor in the horizontal axis. The production function is a concave function, the cost of production is a positively sloped line. Now, here the tenant's return is represented by a parallel downward shift of the production function, and the return curve is represented here in terms of tenant's return. Here, tenant is maximizing the level of output. So, the optimum production decision comes from the tenant. Now, where will that optimal level of production be? Here, the optimal level of production will be at that point where the slope of the tenant's return curve will be equal to the slope of the cost of production line. Now, this happens here at the output level AL. Now, what is the major characteristic of this equilibrium? See, Here, the slope of tenant's return curve is equal to the slope of the production function. So, at the point where the slope of tenant's return curve is equal to the slope of the cost of production line, the slope of the production function also equates the slope of the cost of production line. So, in this case, the level of output corresponds to the benchmark level of efficiency. In other words, we can say that this output level is efficient. So, the output level AL here represents the efficient level of output. Obviously, the corresponding level of employment should also be the efficient level of employment. The only difference in this case is that of the total output level AL, the amount AB will be given to the landowners, while the tenant will get only the amount BL. What about the sharecropping? In case of sharecropping, the tenant gets a part of the total output. For example, if the contract is a 50-50 contract, then out of the total production, the tenant will get 50% of the total produce. In other words, this would mean that the tenant's return will in this case be half of the total produce. Now, in terms of diagram, this would mean that the tenant's return curve will lie below the production function and will become flatter compared to that of the production function. Now, if we move out of the 50-50 situation and consider a more generalized situation, then the condition will remain the same. That means the tenant's return curve will be comparatively flatter than the production function. This is represented in this particular figure. Now, once we represent the production function and tenant's return curve, the next question that arises in our mind is, what will be the optimal level of output? See here, the tenant is the production decision maker, as in the case of fixed rent contract. So, the tenant will set the output level where the slope of the tenant's return curve will be equal to the slope of the cost of production line. Now, in this case, this occurs at the output level Y1 and the corresponding employment level L1. Now, if we compare this with the efficient production level, then we find that the efficient production level OY is greater than the output level under sharecropping, which is OY1. On the other hand, the efficient amount of employment is OL, but in this case, the optimum level of employment OL1 is less than the level of OL. This in turn implies that in case of sharecropping, both the output and employment level will be lower than that of the benchmark case. In this sense, production decision under sharecropping is suboptimal. Now, what happens to the third case? That is the case of fixed wage contract. In fixed wage contract, the landowner hires labor at a fixed wage. In this case, the incentive problem can be described in the following way. See, here the tenant or the hired labor gets no share of additional output. Now, if the tenant do not get any share of the additional output, naturally there will be no incentive on part of the tenant to supply additional labor to produce additional output. So, in this situation, there is a high chance that the optimal amount of labor may not be provided. So, even in this case, there is a chance of producing an output level which is suboptimal. So, what we get from it is that the fixed rent contract is the optimal form of contract. Any other form of contract like fixed wage contract or sharecropping inherits certain incentive related problems. Now, these lead to lower level of employment and output. Now, if this is the case, then we would expect that any rational landowner would always prefer fixed rent contract compared to sharecropping or fixed wage contract. So, if this argument is true, then it would in turn suggest that in the real world we shall observe the dominance of fixed rent contract. So, given this theoretical understanding, let us move to the third question. What type of contract do we observe in reality? Now, if we try to observe the relative importance of different types of land contracts in reality, let us at first start with India. The International Crop Research Institute from the semi-arid tropics, which is commonly known as ICRISAT, tracks detailed data of representative households from Indian semi-arid tropics. The term semi-arid tropic is quite important in this context because most of the agriculture in the third world is carried in the semi-arid tropics. Now, if we observe the ICRISAT data for the period 1975 to 82, we find that 18% of all the landowners engage sharecroppers. Only 4.1% of the landowners, they engage themselves in fixed rent contracts. So, this is a paradoxical result in the sense that instead of being dominated by fixed rent contract, land market in India is dominated by sharecroppers. The figure is not different for Africa. In Africa, from the colonial times, sharecropping has been the dominant form of land contract. White farmers who owned most of the lands were unable to cultivate in most part of the land. They let the Africans to cultivate the land as sharecroppers. Now, this type of agreement has reappeared in African countries including Ghana and Zimbabwe in recent times. So, even in recent times, Africa is showing the dominance of sharecropping. Now, even if we consider Latin America, we find that in countries like Mexico, sharecropping has been the most dominant form of contract. The nature of contract, however, varies from crop to crop and region to region. Whatever be the case, in almost all developing countries, sharecropping dominates the land rental market. Why is it so? That will be the topic of our next module. However, what we have learned so far can be summarized as there exist three types of land rental contracts: fixed rent contract, fixed wage contract and sharecropping. Theoretically, fixed rent is the most efficient form of contract. Others have certain incentive related problems. Thirdly, in developing world, sharecropping, instead of being considered inefficient, has been the most popular form of contract. So this is what we have for this module. Thanks for watching.